Welcome. Before we begin our journey tonight, take a moment to notice where you are. Perhaps you are lying in bed, the weight of blankets gently pressing against you. Perhaps the room is dark, the hum of night settling in around you. Or perhaps you are listening in the early hours of morning, as the world slowly stirs awake. Wherever you are, and whatever time it is, this is your time to rest, to drift, to be carried by the quiet rhythm of history. Tonight, we turn to a chapter of the past that is both haunting and deeply human: the witch hunts of Europe. You may already imagine the images, the word which conjures shadows, trials, accusations whispered in the dark. But the reality, as with most of history, was quieter, stranger, and more complex than legend suggests. The witch hunts were not sudden storms of superstition, but long seasons of fear and suspicion, stretching across centuries. Picture yourself walking through a small village in 16th century Europe. The ground is damp from the morning mist, the narrow lanes uneven beneath your feet. The air is thick with the smell of wood smoke drifting from hearths. Chickens scuttle across the path. A cart creaks slowly, its wheels worn with use. On the surface, life appears ordinary: fields to tend, bread to bake, prayers to be said in the small stone church at the center of town. And yet, beneath that ordinary rhythm, there is unease. A cow sickens unexpectedly, and neighbors whisper. A child falls ill, and suspicion stirs. A storm destroys the crops, and someone must be blamed. In this world, the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was not firm. Misfortune was not random. It was often thought to be caused by unseen hands, by curses, by the work of witches. For us today, the witch hunts seem distant, almost unreal. We know disease comes from germs, not spells. We know storms from weather, not curses. But for those who lived then, the invisible forces of the world felt close, tangible, and dangerous. And so, fear became a constant companion. Over the course of this journey, we will move slowly through the lives of those who lived under this shadow. We will immerse ourselves in daily life during this age of suspicion. We will trace the biographies of the accused and the stories of those who accused. We will look at mysteries of folklore, archaeology, and belief. We will see the roles of women and men, the contrasts between the learned elite and the fearful villager, and we will follow the arc of this long, unsettling chapter of European history, from its rise to its slow, uneasy fading. There will be moments of hardship, as history often contains, but there will also be texture of the fields and kitchens, the churches and courts, the small, ordinary rhythms that surrounded even the darkest accusations. Through it all, my voice will remain steady, unhurried, a quiet companion to carry you deeper into rest. So let us begin gently. Imagine the distant toll of a church bell, its sound carrying slowly through the mist. Imagine the crackle of firewood, the low murmur of voices behind shuttered windows. A village waits in uneasy silence, and into that silence the first whispers of accusation begin. Imagine yourself in a small European village in the late 1500s. The sun is just beginning to rise, spilling pale light across fields damp with dew. A thin mist curls low over the earth, clinging to hedgerows and drifting between thatched rooftops. The morning is cool, and the air smells faintly of wood smoke, mingled with the earthy scent of damp soil and straw. The houses are simple, built of timber or stone, with narrow windows and uneven floors. Inside, the hearth is the heart of the home. Its fire provides warmth, light, and the means to cook. The walls are bare, perhaps hung with a crucifix or a simple carving of a saint. Furniture is sparse: a wooden table, a few stools, rough bedding stuffed with straw. Life is not luxurious, but it is functional. centered on survival and routine. The day begins early. The village stirs with quiet labor. Women fetch water from the well, their buckets scraping and splashing as they carry them home. Children gather kindling, their laughter muted in the cool air. Men head to the fields, tools resting across their shoulders, the sound of boots crunching on frost-hardened soil. Life here follows the cycle of the seasons. In spring, the fields are ploughed and sown. In summer, hay is cut and gathered, the days long and filled with heat. Autumn brings harvest, the gathering of grain and fruit before the frost arrives. Winter is lean, the days short and dim. Work limited to what can be done indoors, mending, weaving, preserving what food remains. The church bell marks the hours, its sound carrying across the village. It calls the faithful to prayer, to mass, to confession. Religion is not a separate part of life. It's woven into every day. Cross yourself before meals. Whisper prayers at dawn and dusk. Seek the priest's blessing for births, marriages, and burials. Faith is the framework, the explanation for both fortune and misfortune. And yet, beneath this rhythm of work and prayer, there is constant unease. Death is close, and sickness common. A child may not survive the winter. A bad harvest could bring hunger. Livestock may sicken or die without clear reason. These are not seen as random misfortunes, but as signs omens, perhaps the work of hidden forces. The night carries its own weight. After sundown, the village grows quiet. Candles flicker in small windows. Beyond the glow of hearth and torch, the world is dark, uncertain, and full of superstition. People tell stories in hushed voices of spirits in the woods, of charms that can heal, of curses that can ruin. The boundary between the natural and the supernatural feels thin. Imagine yourself walking through this village as dusk settles. The air is heavy, cool against your skin. You hear the soft lowing of cattle in their stalls, the muffled barking of a dog. Smoke rises from chimneys, carrying with it the smell of stewing cabbage and bread baking on the hearth. Windows close, doors are barred, and the streets empty. The silence feels complete, but your senses remain alert. In this world, the unseen is always near. Daily life in such a place was defined not only by work, but by community. Everyone knew their neighbors, their histories, their habits. Bonds were close, but suspicion could grow just as easily. If illness spread, if crops failed, if milk turned sour, eyes might turn to someone thought different, someone living on the edge of the village, someone old, poor, or outspoken. For most of us, accustomed to modern conveniences, this life would already feel difficult. There are no machines, no medicine as we know it, no certainty of safety. Every day is labor, every season a struggle. And yet, within this ordinary rhythm, something else waits the fear that a neighbor, a stranger, or even a friend might be a witch. It is within this backdrop of toil, faith, and unease that the witch hunts took root. Daily life seemed steady on the surface, but beneath it, suspicion lingered, ready to flare with the smallest spark. Let us step back to the year 1324, to the medieval town of Kilkenny in Ireland. The streets here are narrow, lined with wooden houses, their roofs of thatch and tile. The air smells of smoke and damp earth, mixed with the faint tang of tanneries and brewing ale. Horses clatter over cobblestones, merchants call out their wares, and the toll of church bells marks the rhythm of the day. In this town, there was a woman named Alice Kyteler. She wasn't poor, and definitely wasn't a loner. Alice was wealthy. She had been married several times, each husband a man of means, and each marriage leaving her with more wealth and influence than before. To her neighbors, This success seemed unusual, perhaps suspicious, in an age when women were expected to be modest, dependent, and silent. Alice's prosperity stood out, and in times of unease, what stands out can quickly become a target. Accusations began to swirl. Her enemies claimed that she had bewitched her husbands, causing their deaths. They said she consorted with demons, that she brewed potions and powders to harm, that she whispered charms in secret. It was whispered that she held gatherings in her home, where candles burned low and words in strange tongues were spoken. The charges were many: that she denied the faith, that she sacrificed animals to dark powers, that she sought control over love and fortune through sorcery. Her servants, too, were accused, drawn into the widening circle of suspicion. At the head of the accusations was Bishop Richard de Ledred, a zealous churchman determined to root out heresy and witchcraft. For weeks he pressed the case, demanding Alice's arrest, insisting her wealth and influence had protected her for too long. Imagine the tension of that trial. The hall crowded, the air thick with murmurs, Alice standing at the center, her face calm, her presence formidable. Around her, priests, officials, neighbors, all watching, all waiting to hear whether she was guilty of dark arts. But Alice was clever. She had wealth, allies, and determination. When the charges grew too dangerous, she fled the town. Slipping away in secret, she vanished from the records. Some say she escaped to England, where she lived out her life quietly. Others say she was sheltered by friends. What became of her remains uncertain, lost to history. Those left behind were not so fortunate. Her servants and followers bore the weight of the accusations. One of them, a woman named Petronilla de Meath, was tortured and forced to confess. She spoke of strange rituals, of powders and spells, of demons appearing in the night. Her words, wrung out under pain, sealed her fate. She was executed, burned before the townspeople, a warning, a spectacle, an ending. Alice herself escaped, but her case marked something larger. It was one of the first fully recorded witch trials in Europe. From Kilkenny, the pattern would spread: accusations, confessions, trials, punishments. What began as whispers around a wealthy woman became a template for centuries of fear. Imagine yourself in that courtroom, the walls dim with candlelight, the air close and heavy. You hear the rustle of robes, the low chant of prayers, the sharp words of accusation. Outside, the town waits, uncertain, fearful, eager for resolution. Inside, a life hangs in the balance, not just Alice's, but the many who would follow in her shadow. The story of Alice Kyteler reminds us of how fragile life could be when suspicion turned to accusation. Wealth could not protect you. Influence could not shield you. A rumor, a whisper, a single complaint could grow into a trial, and a trial could end in fire. It was only the beginning. When we hear the word witchcraft today, it may conjure images of shadowy figures, cloaked in secrecy, casting spells by moonlight. But in the Europe of the witch hunts, much of what was feared as sorcery began with ordinary customs, with small acts of survival in a world full of uncertainty. Imagine a woman in her cottage, kneeling beside a wooden chest. Inside are bundles of herbs, tied carefully with twine. Dried rosemary, its scent sharp and clean. Sage, earthy and grounding. Lavender, its fragrance calming even in a room dim with smoke. These herbs were not sinister, they were medicine. Gathered from fields and hedgerows, knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. In an age before doctors were common, before medicines were known, such remedies were vital. A sprig of rosemary to ease headaches, a poultice of garlic to draw out infection, a tea of chamomile to soothe a restless child. These were acts of care, not danger. And yet, they carried mystery. The line between natural and supernatural was not clear. Alongside herbs, there were charms. A ribbon tied around the wrist to ward off fever. Words whispered softly over water before giving it to the sick. A small pouch of salt or iron hung above a cradle to protect an infant from unseen spirits. These were not unusual, they were common, almost ordinary. And yet, if misfortune struck, such acts could be remembered, reinterpreted, and twisted into accusations of witchcraft. Imagine walking through a village in winter. The air is sharp, your breath curling into frost. In one house, a cow has stopped giving milk. In another, a child coughs through the night. A woman remembered for giving herbs, for whispering prayers, is suddenly seen in a different light. Her remedies become spells. Her words become curses. Her care becomes danger. Archaeology, too, has revealed glimpses of this hidden world. Beneath old hearths, small objects have been found: shoes tucked into chimneys, dried cats sealed into walls, iron nails arranged in careful patterns. These were not evidence of witches, but of fear. People believed such objects could ward off evil, protect the household from spirits or malice. Even ordinary homes carried these quiet mysteries, hidden in the very walls. The church, too, blurred the boundary. Holy water was sprinkled to banish illness. Relics of saints were carried for protection. Prayers were said to drive away storms, to heal sickness, to guard against evil. To the villager, a charm and a prayer were not so different. They were both ways of reaching for safety in an unpredictable world. And yet, when suspicion grew, the difference became dangerous. A priest's blessing was holy. A whispered charm at the hearth could be heresy. The same act that comforted one neighbor could condemn another. Imagine yourself in such a world. You hold a sprig of sage, its leaves dry and fragrant. You tie a ribbon above your child's bed, a gesture of love and protection. For years, it is harmless, even accepted. And then, one day, the cow dies, the weather turns. The harvest fails, and suddenly, the same ribbon is proof of witchcraft. This was the mystery of culture in that time. Survival itself was shadowed by suspicion. Practices rooted in care could be recast as danger. What was medicine to one person could be sorcery to another. The line was never clear, and the fear of crossing it shaped daily life for centuries. So, as we reflect on the witch hunts, we see not only trials and accusations, but also these quieter layers, bundles of herbs, whispered charms, small protections hidden in the home. Simple acts, caught between necessity and fear. To understand the witch hunts, it is important to see not only the fears of ordinary villagers, but the layers of society in which those fears took shape. Imagine again a small village. Its houses are low and plain, its streets muddy, its people living close to the land. Here, life is precarious. Crops can fail, animals can sicken, children can die suddenly. In such a world, neighbors watch one another closely. Every action is noticed, every quarrel remembered. And when misfortune strikes, suspicion often falls not on the powerful, but on those who stand slightly apart: the old widow, the outspoken midwife, the poor man who mutters when passing others in the lane. For the peasantry, witchcraft was both explanation and accusation. They lived close to the rhythms of the earth, with little margin for loss. When a cow died, when hail destroyed the wheat, it felt impossible to accept chance alone. Misfortune needed a cause, and often that cause was found in the figure of a witch. Now lift your gaze to the world of the elite, the nobles, the wealthy, the magistrates, and the learned clergy. Their houses were larger, their clothes finer, their lives more secure. But they too feared witchcraft, though in a different form. For them, witches were not simply neighbors gone astray, but enemies of God, servants of the devil himself. Learned men wrote long treatises on sorcery, on pacts with demons, on the spread of heresy. To them, witchcraft was not only personal misfortune, it was cosmic rebellion, a danger to church and order. Imagine a court where accusations are heard. At the center sit men of power, magistrates, priests, landowners, robes neat, expressions solemn. Before them stands a poor villager, accused by neighbors, unable to defend herself with eloquence or influence. The balance of power is stark. The elite interprets, the villagers accused. The accused is caught between. The clergy held a special role. They were guardians of faith, interpreters of misfortune, voices of authority. A priest might calm his flock by blessing the fields, sprinkling holy water, offering prayers against storms. But he might also stir suspicion, preaching that witches walked among them, that Satan sought their souls. His words carried weight. A single sermon could turn unease into accusation. Yet clergy were not always united. Some doubted the reality of witchcraft, warning against hysteria. Others pressed for harsh punishment, convinced that the devil's work was everywhere. The tension between these voices shaped the course of countless trials. For women, the contrasts were especially sharp. In most villages, women carried the burden of domestic life, cooking, tending children, caring for animals, gathering herbs. This closeness to the fragile boundaries of health and misfortune made them vulnerable to suspicion. If a child sickened after a woman offered a blessing, her words might be remembered as a curse. If bread failed to rise after she needed it, her touch might be feared. Among elite women, suspicion lingered too, though differently. Wealth could offer protection, but not always immunity. As in the case of Alice Kyteler, influence itself could breed suspicion. To be too wealthy, too independent, too outspoken was also dangerous. Imagine standing at the edge of a trial. The accused is a poor woman, her clothes worn, her voice trembling. The judges are men of status, their words crisp, their gaze steady. Around them gather villagers, their faces lined with worry, their whispers sharp with fear. Here the layers of society pressed together. The poor vulnerable to accusation, the elite powerful in judgment, the clergy interpreting it all through the lens of faith. And yet, beneath the differences, there was a shared unease. Whether peasant or noble, farmer or priest, all lived in a world where misfortune was constant and explanations were needed. All lived within a culture that believed in unseen forces, in the nearness of good and evil. It was this shared belief that allowed suspicion to flow upward and downward, binding society together in fear. So the witch hunts were never just about witches. They were about power, about class, about the fragile web of relationships between rich and poor, rulers and ruled, neighbors and strangers. For most of us today, accustomed to individuality and personal rights, this structure would feel suffocating. But in early modern Europe, it was the very fabric of life, and it was within that fabric that the threads of accusation were woven. Imagine yourself in a European village once more. The morning air is cool, and the rhythm of daily life is unfolding. Women at the well drawing water, their skirts damp from the splashes. Women at the hearth kneading breads, stirring pots. Women tending infants, carrying herbs gathered from the fields, or leaning over baskets of laundry by the stream. Women were the heartbeat of the household, the keepers of health, the ones who managed the fragile balance between survival and misfortune. Yet it was precisely this closeness to life's uncertainties that made them vulnerable when suspicion arose. Across Europe, the vast majority of those accused of witchcraft were women. Some were old, their faces lined, their bodies bent with years of labor. Others were widows, living without the protection of a husband, their independence unsettling in a patriarchal society. Some were young and outspoken, their words sharp in disputes with neighbors. Some were midwives or healers, whose knowledge of herbs and childbirth set them apart. In each case, being outside the expected role of quiet obedience could draw suspicion. Imagine an elderly woman in the village. Her house is small, her fire burns low. She mutters to herself as she walks, her voice scratchy, her back stooped. Children whisper about her as she passes. When a cow sickens, her name is spoken. When the bread fails to rise, her presence is recalled. Her age, her solitude, her difference all become evidence in the eyes of her neighbors. Or picture a midwife, her hands skilled from years of practice. She has seen both the joy of birth and the sorrow of loss. In a time when childbirth was perilous, she could be both trusted and feared. If a mother or infant died despite her care, her knowledge could suddenly appear unnatural, her presence dangerous. Even the simple act of speaking freely could be a risk. Women who quarreled openly, who cursed when angry, who stood firm in disputes, were remembered in times of misfortune. Harsh words spoken in frustration could be reinterpreted as curses when a neighbor fell ill. Silence might have protected, but silence also erased. For the authorities, two women became central to the image of witchcraft. Learned writers of the time described women as more susceptible to the devil's temptations, more prone to weakness, more likely to stray from faith. The very qualities expected of them, obedience, modesty, quietness, were turned into reasons for suspicion when absent. Imagine the weight of this expectation. To be always careful with your words, to soften your gaze, to avoid standing apart, to live not only under the watch of your family, but under the constant gaze of the village. For most women, this was simply life. But for some, it meant danger at every turn. And yet, women were not only the accused, they were also the accusers. In many villages, it was other women who whispered first, who pointed fingers, who recalled quarrels and misfortunes. This was not always malice. Often it was desperation. In a world where explanations were needed, suspicion offered answers. And in communities bound tightly together, tension between neighbors often spilled into accusations of witchcraft. Imagine sitting by the fire on a long winter evening. A circle of women gathers, spinning wool, mending clothes, speaking quietly. The talk drifts from crops to children to neighbors. Someone recalls a quarrel. Someone else remembers a misfortune. In the soft glow of firelight, suspicion grows. Tomorrow, in daylight, it may take shape as an accusation. The role of women in the witch hunts was therefore complex. They were the majority of the accused, shaped by fear and cultural expectation. But they were also part of the communities that sustained those fears. Bound by duty, defined by suspicion, they lived in a world where being too different, too independent, too outspoken, or sometimes simply too unfortunate could bring disaster. For us today, accustomed to choice and independence, this fragility is difficult to imagine. But for women of early modern Europe, it was the air. They breathed the constant awareness that their lives, their work, even their kindness could be turned against them. And so, as the witch hunts unfolded, women bore the greatest weight. Their roles as healers, midwives, caretakers, and simply as neighbors made them indispensable. But it also made them vulnerable. They lived always on the thin line between trust and suspicion, between necessity and danger. In the world of early modern Europe, fear did not come only from hunger, illness, or war. Fear also came from what was unseen, from spirits, curses, and above all, from the devil. Imagine a winter night in a village. The houses are dark, save for the faint flicker of firelight through shutters. Outside, the fields are bare, the trees skeletal against a pale moon. The air is sharp, each breath clouding before you. In such a setting, the silence itself feels alive. Every creak of wood, every howl of wind, every distant cry of an animal seems touched with mystery. For people then, the devil was not an abstract figure. He was believed to move through the world, seeking souls, tempting the weak, twisting the order of God's creation. His presence was felt in storms, in sickness, in sudden misfortune. And those who were accused of witchcraft were thought to be his servants' people who had entered into a pact with him, exchanging loyalty for power. Folklore gave shape to these fears. Stories were told by firelight, whispered in the shadows. Tales of witches who flew through the night on broomsticks or on the backs of animals. Stories of secret gatherings, sabbats where witches danced under the moon, feasting and singing in the company of demons. Accounts of witches who could transform themselves, slipping through the night as cats, wolves, or hares. For us, these images may seem fantastical, almost like tales meant for children, but to those who heard them centuries ago, they were real. They explained the unexplainable. They gave form to the invisible. Imagine sitting by the fire as a child, listening to elders tell such stories. The flames flicker, casting long shadows across the walls. You hear of neighbors who might not be what they seem, of charms that could protect, of curses that could harm. Sleep comes uneasily, your dreams filled with shapes moving at the edge of the dark. The church reinforced these fears. Sermons warned that the devil sought to corrupt the faithful. Priests spoke of heresy, of souls lost to temptation, of witches who worshipped the devil in secret. Learned texts described in careful detail how witches made their pact-signing books in blood, rejecting baptism, pledging their loyalty to Satan. Such images, repeated again and again, gave fear its framework. When misfortune struck a storm, an illness, a death, the devil and his supposed servants became a ready explanation. The world felt too fragile, too uncertain, to be left to chance alone. Even natural places were touched by this belief. Forests were thought to be home to spirits, crossroads to demons, mountains to strange forces. A tree struck by lightning, a stone worn by strange marks, an animal behaving oddly could be seen as a sign of witchcraft. The ordinary became mysterious, the natural became supernatural. But alongside fear, there were always attempts at protection. Holy water sprinkled across doorways, crosses carved into wooden beams, herbs tied above a cradle, bells rung to drive away storms. Folklore did not only tell of danger, it offered remedies, ways to push back against the darkness. Imagine yourself walking through such a village at dusk. The sound of a bell rings slowly across the fields. The last traces of sunlight fade, and the first stars appear. In the distance, a dog barks. A shutter closes. And though the night is calm, the thought lingers that perhaps, beyond what you see, forces unseen are moving. It was this constant balance, fear of the devil, belief in folklore, hope for protection, that gave the witch hunts their power. The accusations were not born from nothing. They were woven from centuries of story, sermon, and superstition, threads of belief that touched every life. And in this world, even the smallest sign, a muttered curse, a strange illness, a shadow at the window could tip the balance from fear to accusation. Imagine a village where unease lingers. Perhaps a storm has ruined the crops. Perhaps livestock have died, or a child has fallen ill. Neighbors gather at the well, their voices low, their glances sharp. A name is spoken not loudly, but just enough to take root. Someone is different. Someone is to blame. This is how many accusations began, not in courts or councils, but in the quiet spaces of daily life. A quarrel over land, a dispute at the market, an insult remembered from months before. In moments of misfortune, these grievances resurfaced, reshaped into suspicion. And suspicion, once spoken, was difficult to silence. From there, the machinery of accusation turned slowly but heavily. The first step was often a complaint brought before local officials or the parish priest. Their word carried authority. If they chose to believe the whispers, the accused would be summoned for questioning. Imagine being called into such a space. The room is plain, lit by narrow windows or flickering candles. At the table sit men of authority, magistrates, priests, perhaps a scribe, recording every word. Their questions come steadily, measured but insistent. Why did the cow sicken after you passed by? Why was the child ill after you visited? Why were you seen muttering at the edge of the field? For the accused, answers mattered little. In a world where belief in witchcraft was woven deeply into culture, ordinary acts could be twisted into proof. A quarrel became evidence of cursing. A remedy became evidence of sorcery. A dream, even, could be called as testimony. If suspicion grew, a trial might follow. These trials varied across Europe. In some places, they were brief hearings before local courts. In others, elaborate proceedings overseen by church or secular authorities. Witnesses were called neighbors, family, sometimes even children. Each told their stories, weaving a net of evidence from fragments of memory, rumor, and fear. Confession was the ultimate goal, and here the process darkens. Pressure was immense. In many places, accused individuals were questioned under duress, sometimes deprived of sleep, sometimes confronted with threats, sometimes subjected to harsher measures. The mind, weary and frightened, could falter under such strain. People confessed to what they had never done, weaving tales of midnight gatherings, of pacts with the devil, of flying through the night simply to end their torment. Imagine the weight of such a moment. A woman, exhausted, sits before her judges. Her voice is faint, her body trembling. She speaks of things she has never done. Her words shaped by the questions, her silence interpreted as guilt. Outside, the village waits, their unease sharpened into expectation. Once confession was given or, once the court judged guilt sufficient, the sentence followed. In some regions, it was imprisonment. In others, banishment. But more often, it was death, carried out publicly as both punishment and warning. The machinery of accusation was self-sustaining. A confession often included the names of others, spoken under pressure. Those names led to new accusations, new trials, new confessions. Suspicion spread like ripples on water, reaching further with each case, for the villagers' trials confirmed their fears. If the courts declared someone guilty, then the danger was real, and if the danger was real, then more witches might be hiding among them. Fear created accusation. Accusation created trials. Trials created more fear. Imagine, then, the silence of the village after such a trial. The accused gone, the sentence carried out, the community returning to its fields and hearths. On the surface, life continues. The bread is kneaded, the cattle tended, the church bells ring as before. But beneath the rhythm, suspicion lingers. Who will be next? This was the machinery of the witch hunts. It was not only the devil or folklore that kept them alive, but also the structures of society, neighbors, priests, magistrates, all turning whispers into judgments, judgments into sentences, and sentences into memory. And for those caught in the machinery, Escape was rare. Imagine yourself walking through a small village once more. The morning is calm, a thin mist lifting from the fields. A rooster crows in the distance. Smoke curls gently from chimneys. On the surface, life feels ordinary. But beneath this ordinariness lingers unease. Each household watches the others. Each family remembers small quarrels, sharp words, misfortunes that seemed to follow certain neighbors. Fear during the witch hunts was not always loud. Often, it was quiet, woven into the texture of daily life. At the well, where women gathered to draw water, conversations were cautious. A laugh held too long, a whisper exchanged, a muttered complaintal could be remembered later in darker light. At the market, where villagers sold their eggs, bread, and cloth, sharp glances could follow someone whose goods spoiled, whose milk soured, whose animals grew thin. Suspicion grew not in moments of drama, but in small, repeated observations, magnified by fear. Imagine a farmer finding that his cows give no milk. The cause might be illness, or simply bad luck. But as he thinks back, he remembers the neighbor who walked by the pasture the day before, muttering to herself. The image lingers, and soon it becomes explanation. The cow was cursed. Or picture a child falling ill with fever. A mother remembers the woman who touched the child's head at church, her hand cool, her eyes sharp. Days later, when the fever worsens, that memory becomes something else. Not care, but harm. In this way, suspicion worked backward. Misfortune came first, blame followed. And blame often fell on those who lived slightly apart. The old widow whose voice was sharp, the midwife whose knowledge was unusual, the beggar who asked for bread too often. Fear fractured communities. Neighbors who once worked together in fields now watched each other with unease. Families who once shared bread now whispered behind closed doors. Even kindness could be dangerous. To offer herbs, to speak a blessing, to comfort a sick child. These small acts, meant in care, could later be remembered as proof of witchcraft. Imagine the tension of a village evening. The sun sets, and people return to their homes. Doors are bolted, shutters closed. The sound of prayer drifts softly from windows. Yet behind those prayers are worries about the health of livestock, about the safety of children, about the neighbor who walks alone too often, who speaks too freely, who seems too different. This constant fear made ordinary life exhausting. Every action had to be measured, every word considered. A quarrel could last for years, its memory resurfacing when misfortune struck. A gesture of impatience, a curse muttered under the breath. A scowl at the well could someday return as testimony in a trial. And so, suspicion seeped into the smallest details of community life. The rhythm of farming, of baking, of prayer continued as before, but always with a shadow. Who could be trusted? Who might be hiding secrets? For us today, accustomed to privacy, individuality, and the freedom to live unnoticed, such constant watchfulness feels heavy. But for those who lived then, it was simply the air they breathed. The village was close-knit, lives intertwined, and fear travelled quickly along those ties. Imagine yourself once more walking through that village. You hear laughter at one doorway, the sound of a child's cry at another. You see smoke rising steadily from hearths. Everything looks peaceful, and yet you sense the tension beneath. You feel the weight of eyes watching, the quiet unease that anyone, any neighbor, any friend could become an accuser or accused. This was everyday life under the witch hunts. Ordinary, familiar, and yet shadowed always by fear. In the quiet rhythm of village life, children were rarely silent observers. They played in the fields, fetched water, carried small bundles of firewood, and listened closely to the words of their elders. In the world of the witch hunts, they also became witnesses, and sometimes even accusers. Imagine a child, wide-eyed, sitting at the edge of a gathering by the hearth. The elders whisper of misfortunes, of neighbors suspected, of curses feared. The child listens, absorbing every word. Later, when asked by authorities, the child repeats what was heard. A gesture remembered, a strange look, a dream half-formed. These become testimony. Children were often believed, their innocence seen as proof of truth. If a child said they had seen a neighbor whispering to the devil, or flying through the night, their words carried weight. They could not be imagined to invent such things, so adults believed. And so, in some trials, children's voices became part of the machinery of accusation. Their stories fueling the fear of communities already strained by misfortune. Confessions, too, widened suspicion. Once an accused person was brought before authorities, pressure was applied to make them speak. Sometimes this pressure was subtle, endless questioning, long hours without rest, the insistence that silence was guilt. Sometimes it was harsher, designed to break the will. In such circumstances, many confessed to things they had never done. They spoke of meetings with the devil, of secret gatherings, of spells and charms. And often they gave names of friends, of neighbors, of anyone who came to mind under strain. Imagine the silence of such a moment. A woman, weary and trembling, whispers a name, perhaps to satisfy her interrogators, perhaps simply to end the questions. That name is written down. It is passed to the officials. And soon another knock is heard on another door. This is how accusations spread. One confession led to another accusation. Another accusation led to another trial. Villagers found themselves caught in widening circles of fear, where each case created new suspects, each word of testimony unraveling the fragile trust of community life. The pattern was not confined to small villages. In larger cities, too, accusations multiplied. In Würzburg and Bamberg, in Germany, entire waves of trials swept through communities. Children named adults, adults named neighbors, and neighbors named kin. The web grew wider until hundreds stood accused. Imagine the unease of living in such a place. Each day, more names spoken. Each week, more trials held. The list of the accused stretching further, touching every family, every street. To live here was to feel constantly exposed, never certain who might speak your name. And yet, for those inside this world, it felt undeniable. Confessions seemed to confirm what people already believed, that witches were real, that the devil worked among them, that misfortunes were caused by unseen hands. The words of children, the words of neighbors, the words of the accused themselves all became proof. For us now, looking back, it is easy to see the frailty of such evidence. We know how fear and pressure can shape words. We know how memory bends, how imagination grows under strain. But for them, in their world, each confession carried weight, each testimony deepened fear. Imagine once more the village at night. The air is still, but the people are restless. Somewhere, a child stirs in sleep, dreaming of shadows. Somewhere else, a woman whispers a confession she does not believe. And with each word, the circle of fear grows wider, touching lives that only yesterday seemed safe. This was how the witch hunts spread, not only through belief in the devil, not only through folklore, but through the fragile voices of children, the weary words of confessions, and the ripple of suspicion carried from door to door. When suspicion turned to trial, and trial turned to confession, the question often became not whether a person was guilty, but how to make them admit it. In many parts of Europe, Confession was considered the strongest proof. Without it, a case might falter. And so, those in authority sought ways to compel it. Sometimes this meant long hours of questioning, repeated day after day, the accused deprived of sleep, their mind weary and confused. Sometimes it meant physical strain, devices designed not to kill but to break the will. Imagine a dim chamber, its stone walls cold, its air heavy with smoke from torches. The accused sits, hands bound, eyes hollow with exhaustion. Questions repeat, steady and unyielding. Did you meet the devil? Did you curse the cattle? Did you join a gathering at night? At first, silence, then denial. But as the hours stretch on, the will falters. Words are spoken, not from truth, but from weariness, from fear, from the desire for it all to end. Punishments, too, carried weight, far beyond the individual. Sentences varied. In some places, fines or exile. In others, imprisonment. But often, the final penalty was death carried out, not in secret, but in public. Imagine the town square on such a day. The air is heavy, the crowd hushed. Neighbors gather, their faces solemn, their eyes fixed on the figure at the center. The punishment is carried out slowly, deliberately, as both justice and warning. Children clutch their mothers' skirts. Men stand in silence. Priests murmur prayers. For the community, the event is not only the end of one life, but a reinforcement of fear. Witches are real. The devil is near, and vigilance is necessary. For the authorities, such displays were meant to restore order. For the people, they deepened unease. If a neighbor could be judged guilty, who might be next? If punishment fell today on one, could it fall tomorrow on another? The weight of fear did not end with the execution. It lingered. Houses left empty, fields untended, children orphaned, families marked by suspicion. Communities carried the memory long after the punishment was over. And yet, even in this grim rhythm, there was detachment. Life went on. After the crowd dispersed, villagers returned to their fields, their hearths, their ordinary tasks. Bread was kneaded, cattle tended, prayers whispered. But the memory remained, quietly shaping behavior. People spoke more carefully, quarreled less openly, offered fewer remedies, withdrew from gestures that might be misunderstood. Imagine the silence of a village night after such a punishment. The streets are empty, the houses closed. Behind doors, families sit close, speaking little. Outside, the air is cool, the stars bright, yet the village feels heavier, its rhythm slowed by fear. For us today, it is difficult to imagine such a life where justice itself could become a tool of fear. Where survival meant not only enduring hunger and cold, but also silence, caution, conformity. But for those who lived through the witch hunts, this was reality. The machinery of punishment was not just about ending lives. It was about shaping communities, ensuring obedience, reinforcing belief. And in that way, its weight extended far beyond the accused, pressing down on everyone, day after day, year after year. The witch hunts were not confined to a single village, or even a single country. They stretched across Europe, their rhythm echoing from the far north to the warmer south, from small hamlets to great cities. And though each place had its own customs, its own laws, and its own fears, the pattern was familiar. Suspicion, accusation, trial, and punishment. Imagine traveling slowly across the map of Europe, drifting from region to region, each with its own story to tell. In Germany, the hunts reached some of their most intense heights. In the bishoprics of Würzburg and Bamberg during the early 1600s, entire communities were swept into waves of accusation. Hundreds were tried, from the poorest peasants to members of the clergy, even children. Imagine a town where each week brings new names, where trials become daily routine, where fear spreads so widely that no family feels safe. For those living there, the hunts were not an isolated event, but a consuming storm. Further west, in France, suspicion took many forms. In Normandy and Lorraine, courts heard testimony of flying at night, of feasts with demons, of storms conjured by spells. But in some places, the courts were more cautious. Judges hesitated to condemn, skeptical of wild tales. In France, as elsewhere, the outcome often depended less on the people and more on the authorities who heard their cases. In Scotland, the hunts came in waves, often linked to political and religious upheaval. King James VI himself, fascinated by the subject, wrote a treatise on witchcraft and oversaw trials personally. Imagine the fear of living in a village near the coast, where storms at sea were common. When ships sank, when sailors drowned, it was easy to believe witches had raised the winds. Accusations spread quickly in fishing communities, where the sea was both livelihood and threat. In England, the hunts were somewhat less severe than on the continent, but still left deep marks. The figure of Matthew Hopkins, the self-styled witch-finder general of the 1640s, looms large. He travelled from town to town, examining suspects, pressing confessions, overseeing trials. Imagine the unease as he arrived in a village, his reputation preceding him, his methods feared by all. For some, his presence meant sudden accusation. For others, the false comfort of safety bought at another's expense. Further south, in Italy and Spain, witchcraft was sometimes overshadowed by the Inquisition's broader concern with heresy. Yet trials did occur, often shaped by local folklore. In alpine valleys, witches were accused of flying through the night to join in Mediterranean towns, they were linked with storms, plagues, or the sudden withering of crops. Even in Scandinavia, the hunts reached into fishing villages and icy coastal towns. In Sweden and Finland, children were often central to accusations, their testimony shaping entire trials. Imagine a northern night, the sky alive with the shifting light of the aurora. To us, it is beauty. To them, perhaps, it was a sign and omen of forces beyond human control, interpreted through the lens of witchcraft. Each region had its own rhythm, its own fears, its own authorities. And yet, beneath the differences, the pattern was the same: fear of misfortune, belief in the devil, suspicion of neighbors, confessions wrung from the weary, punishments carried out in public squares. Imagine standing on a hillside at dusk, looking out across the map of Europe. Villages scattered like small lights in the dark, each one carrying its own fears, its own stories of witches whispered by firelight. Some are small, some vast, but all connected by the same thread of unease. For centuries, the hunts moved across the continent like a slow tide, rising and falling with the times. And though the intensity varied, the presence of suspicion was always near. Every storm eventually passes. The witch hunts, which once swept across Europe with such force, did not end suddenly in a single year or with a single decree. Instead, they faded slowly, their edges fraying over time, until the fear that had once seemed unshakable lost its grip. Imagine the late 1600s. The same villages remain, their houses of timber and stone, their fields stretching toward the horizon. But the whispers of witchcraft are quieter now, the trials fewer. People still tell stories of witches by the fire, but the courts begin to hesitate. The old machinery of accusation no longer runs so easily. Several changes brought this decline. One was the growth of skepticism. Learned men, judges, and even clergy began to question the wild tales told in court. Could a woman truly fly through the night? Could storms really be raised by a whispered curse? Confessions, they realized, often came under pressure, unreliable and shaped by fear. Where once such words were accepted as proof, now they began to be doubted. Another was the slow rise of science. Illness, once blamed on curses, was gradually understood as disease. Storms and crop failures, once thought to be caused by sorcery, began to be studied as natural events. Imagine a physician explaining that fever spread from person to person, not from spell to spell. Imagine a scholar charting the skies, finding order in the movements of stars, rather than omens in their brightness. Bit by bit, natural explanations replaced supernatural ones. Religion, too, began to shift. The wars of the Reformation and Counter-Reformation had once fueled suspicion, each side quick to accuse the other of heresy and witchcraft. But as those conflicts calmed, so too did the appetite for witch trials. Unity, order, and stability became more valued than the pursuit of hidden enemies. The courts themselves changed. Judges grew wary of accepting spectral evidence claims that witches had appeared in dreams or visions. Without such evidence, many cases collapsed. Authorities realized that trials often brought more chaos than peace, dividing communities, sowing mistrust, leaving scars that lasted long after the punishment. Imagine a courtroom in the early 1700s. An accused woman stands before the judges, as countless others once did, but this time the questions are different. The judges listen, but they hesitate. They ask for proof, not just rumor. They doubt the testimony of dreams. They weigh the evidence with greater care, and then, at last, they dismiss the case. The machinery halts, the storm begins to pass. By the 18th century, witch hunts had largely faded from Europe. Some isolated cases continued, but they were rare, remnants of a world that was slipping away. People still believed in witches, but the courts no longer pursued them with the same fury. Suspicion lingered in folklore, in fireside tales, in whispers told to children at night, but it no longer commanded the full weight of law. Imagine, then, a village where once witches had been hunted. The same houses, the same fields, the same church bell ringing across the valley. Life continues, but the shadow is lighter. Quarrels still happen, misfortunes still strike, storms still fall. But the words which are spoken less often, and when they are, they no longer carry the same power. The decline of the witch hunts was not only the end of trials. It was also a quiet shift in how people saw the world. From fear to reason, from superstition to science, from suspicion to skepticism. It was a slow turning of the mind, a long release from centuries of unease. And though the fear of witches faded, the memory remained etched into history. Carried in stories, a reminder of how deeply human lives can be shaped by belief, and how fragile safety can feel when fear takes hold. The witch hunts have long since ended. The courts no longer summon villagers to answer charges of sorcery. The devil no longer stands as an explanation for every storm, illness, or misfortune. And yet, the memory remains. Imagine walking through a European town today. The houses are new, the streets paved, electricity humming quietly where once only candles glowed. Life is modern, fast, and full of conveniences unthinkable to the people of centuries past. And yet, in some places, plaques and memorials stand where trials once were held. Museums display old documents, fragile pages filled with names and accusations. In churchyards, stones still mark the resting places of those who lived through fear. Historians remember the witch hunts as cautionary tales. They study the records, the testimonies, the confessions, seeking to understand not only what happened, but why. They see in the trials the fragility of justice, the power of fear, the way ordinary lives can be caught in extraordinary suspicion. The lessons are sobering, but important. Folklore, too, remembers. Even today, stories of witches linger in European culture. Not as feared neighbors, but as figures of legend, women who fly on broomsticks, who stir cauldrons, who speak with spirits in the night. These images, softened and reshaped, find their way into fairy tales, children's books, and modern celebrations. They are no longer sources of terror, but of story and imagination. And yet, beneath the softened folklore lies the memory of the real women, real men, real children whose lives were marked by fear and accusation. Their names sometimes forgotten, their stories sometimes lost, but their presence still felt in the silence of archives. In the empty spaces where their homes once stood, the legacy of the witch hunts is also a reminder of belief's power. When people believe deeply in something, even something unseen, it can shape law, community, and life itself. Belief in witches created centuries of fear, and that fear became action. To reflect on this is to see both the strength and the danger of conviction. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a quiet village green today. Children run and laugh, their voices clear in the air. Families gather, their homes warm and secure. Yet beneath your feet, in the soil of Europe, lies the memory of those who once walked here in fear, who once faced accusation, who once carried the weight of suspicion. The earth remembers, even when we forget. And in that memory there is a lesson. The witch hunts are not only part of the past, they are reminders of how easily fear can grow, how quickly suspicion can divide, how fragile justice can be when belief overwhelms reason. Yet they are also reminders of endurance. Communities survived, even after the fear passed. Families rebuilt, fields were sown again, bread was baked, prayers whispered. The rhythm of life continued, even after centuries of shadow. Today, when we speak of witches, we often do so with curiosity, sometimes even with affection, as symbols of mystery, of independence, of old wisdom. The meaning has shifted, softened, reshaped by time. But within that new image, the echoes of the past remain. Imagine the quiet of night as you reflect on this, the flicker of a candle, the whisper of wind, the calm of a world no longer haunted by accusations. The memory is there, but it rests now, as history, as story, as a lesson to carry gently forward. As we look back across centuries, it can feel almost impossible to imagine ourselves in the world of the witch hunts. And yet, to understand why we would not survive there, it helps to linger on the contrasts between their lives and our own. Imagine again the narrow lanes of a village, the small houses clustered close together, the fields stretching outward. Life there was bound by necessity. Food was uncertain, sickness common, and survival always a matter of hard labor. But alongside these hardships was something more fragile, the constant threat of suspicion. For us today, misfortune has explanations that bring comfort. We know illness comes from viruses or bacteria, not curses. We know storms are natural. Crops fail for reasons of weather or soil. We turn to doctors, to science, to technology. In the world of the witch hunts, explanations were different. Misfortune was not random. It was caused by the devil, by witches, by unseen hands. To live in such a world meant to carry unease with every cough, every storm, every loss. Imagine now an ordinary quarreler, sharp word exchanged at the market. A dispute over land, a neighbor turning away in silence. In our time, such disagreements may linger, but they rarely become more than that. In theirs, those same moments could grow into accusations, trials, punishments. To survive in such a world was to measure every word, every gesture, every silence. Freedom, too, was limited. Today, we are accustomed to individuality, to privacy, to the idea that our lives belong to us. In early modern Europe, life was lived under constant watch. Villages were close-knit, neighbors observed neighbors, and community itself was a form of surveillance. One's reputation was fragile, and once damaged, it could never be fully restored. And there was fear not only of hunger or sickness, but of being accused. Imagine lying awake at night, hearing the wind against the shutters, wondering if tomorrow your name might be spoken. Survival was not only physical but social, bound to reputation, to conformity, to silence. For most of us, raised in a world where individuality is valued, where freedom is expected, where belief in science shapes our understanding, this way of life would feel unbearable. We would struggle not only with the cold homes, the hard labor, the lack of medicine, but with the knowledge that every glance, every word, every misfortune could turn against us. And yet, reflection brings gratitude. For while their world was shadowed by fear, ours is softened by understanding. We still face hardship, but we face it with knowledge, with choices, with safety the people of that time could not have imagined. Imagine the contrast. You sit now in comfort, in a warm room, perhaps beneath blankets, the world outside calm. You carry no fear of neighbors accusing you of sorcery, no fear of misfortune being blamed on your presence. The distance between their world and ours is vast, and in that distance lies relief. The witch hunts remind us not only of how harsh the past could be, but of how much has changed. And in this reflection, there is peace. To know that fear has passed, that suspicion has faded, that we live now in a different rhythm. A rhythm where sleep can come quietly, without the shadow of accusation. Imagine once more a village at the edge of Europe, in the time of the witch hunts. It is evening now. The fields are quiet, the air heavy with the smell of earth cooling after the day's labor. Smoke drifts lazily from chimneys, carrying the faint scent of stewing vegetables and wood smoke. The narrow lanes are emptying. Doors creak closed, shutters are drawn against the night. A dog barks once, then falls silent. In the distance, a church bell tolls softly, its sound rolling across the valley like a slow wave. You walk along the edge of the village. The ground beneath your feet is uneven, damp with the settling dew. The cottages stand close, their thatched roofs dark against the fading sky. In one, you see the flicker of candlelight through a crack in the shutters. In another, only shadow. The world feels hushed, expectant, as if holding its breath. In this stillness, you feel both the closeness of life and the weight of fear. The villagers within their homes sit by fires, speaking quietly. Some whisper prayers for protection. Others murmur about neighbors. The unease is never gone, it lingers, even in silence. And yet there is also peace here. The rhythm of life continues. Despite suspicion, the fields will be sown again in spring. The bread will rise again tomorrow. The cattle will be tended at dawn. Even in a time of fear, ordinary life endures. Imagine now stepping beyond the village into the open fields. The air is cool against your skin. Above you, the stars shine, steady and unchanging, as they did for those villagers centuries ago. The wind moves gently through the grass. For a moment, the fears of the village fall away, leaving only stillness. You stand there, between past and present, between their world and yours. You feel the weight of history, but also the distance of time. Their fears are no longer yours. Their suspicions no longer shape your life. What remains is only the echo, soft now, fading into memory. As you breathe slowly, deeply, you let the image of the village dissolve. The cottages fade, the bell falls silent, the night grows still. What lingers is only calm, a gentle rhythm carrying you back to the present. You are here, you are safe. The fears of that world are long gone. And in their place is quiet, quiet to rest, quiet to sleep. And so, our journey through the witch hunts of Europe comes to an end. We have walked the narrow lanes of villages where suspicion lingered behind every shuttered window. We have stepped inside simple cottages, felt the weight of daily toil, and listened to whispers of fear carried from neighbor to neighbor. We have seen how accusations grew, how trials unfolded, how confessions spread. We have traveled across Europe, through Germany, France, Scotland, and beyond, tracing the shadow that stretched across centuries. And we have reflected on what it meant not only for those who lived then, but for us today. Their world was one of fear and suspicion, where misfortune demanded explanation. An explanation often came at the cost of another's life. Ours is a world of knowledge, of safety, of comforts they could never imagine. We live free of their fears, free of their trials, free of the constant watchfulness that shaped their days. And yet, remembering them has meaning. It reminds us of the fragility of justice, of the weight of belief, of the endurance of ordinary lives, even in times of suspicion. It invites us to look at our present world with gratitude for warmth, for freedom, for peace. As you lie here now, in comfort and safety, let the echoes of that distant world fade softly away. The cottages dissolve into memory. The church bell falls silent. The whispers of accusation drift into quiet. What remains is only calm. You are here, you are safe, you are free. And now, as this story closes, gentle music will continue to play, calm and steady, carrying you further into rest. Let it wash over you like a soft tide, easing you deeper until sleep comes quietly, peacefully, fully.